Okay, thank you everybody. Welcome back. We have a session now during which we will be discussing the scope of the GRI 201 standard, economic performance standard review that is being mooted at the moment. I will turn it to Chelsea to lead us through that discussion.
Thank you, Judy. So we have two questions for you. This relates to item 05 in your briefing pack for GSSB members. And really, this is intended to be a in-depth discussion to really get your input and ideas before we move ahead with this review project. We had outlined in item 05 two specific discussion topics to focus the session on. The first, and I want to take them in turn with the group. So we'll cover the first issue, we'll pause for a discussion and input, and then we'll move on to the second one. The first one relates to expanding the scope of review. So last year when the GSSB set out your work program and identified high priority standards for review, we identified GRI 201 economic performance with the potential inclusion of new content related to tax and governments. However, subsequently in the research that we've done, we've also suggested from a standards division perspective that we may want to look at expanding that review to include GRI 202 and 203, and I'll talk you through the rationale in a moment behind that. The second discussion topic we want to touch on is really the issue about developing new content related to tax and tax reporting disclosures. So in the interest of full honesty with this group, when this project came up within our team, no one jumped to volunteer their name to take it on. It turns out tax reporting is not nearly as interesting as the human rights work or the water work or the occupational health and safety project, which is why it has fallen to me. But actually, it's been fantastically interesting and far more, I think, controversial and high profile than I certainly would have expected. And I would also introduce you just for a moment to Claudia Masova, who's in the back of the room, who's one of our research analysts. And she's done a lot of the background research and sort of initial report reviews for both of these topics behind the paper. So she will be working on this a bit going forward. So let's take these in turn. The first topic, expanding the scope of review. I wanted to start by just putting on the screen an overview of the disclosures across these three standards. So GRI 201, economic performance, 202, market presence, and 203, indirect economic impacts. If you look at the list of disclosures that they cover quite a variety of different topics that have all been sort of categorized together underneath these three economic standards. So you have direct economic value generated and distributed. This is the most frequently reported out of this set of indicators, or the G4 indicators, which have now been transitioned to the standards. You have financial implications and other risks and opportunities due to climate change. You have defined benefit plan obligations and other retirement plans. You have financial assistance received from government. That's really where we have sort of the government payment issue covered under the current structure. You have ratios of standard entry-level wage by gender compared to local minimum wage, proportion of senior management hired from the local community, and then within indirect economic impacts, you have infrastructure investments and services supported, and you have what's often referred to as the catch-all indicator, significant indirect economic impacts. So when we began the review of GRI 201, we quickly found that in looking at reporting practice, that the way the disclosures in GRI 201 were reported is often mixed up quite a bit with the disclosures within 202 and 203. And the distinctions between these topics are not often well understood or clearly applied by companies. So we went back and we looked at a lot of the public comment feedback that we received last year during the transition to standards, both from the public comment period, but also from GSSB members who were doing the technical oversight of the transition work on these standards. And we found that actually there were quite a lot of comments that related to content around the clarity of the disclosures, the suitability of these disclosures to really capture the impacts that were being reported under these topics. And also we had lots of comments about market presence as a topic. What is market presence? well, what is market presence, and should it be renamed to better reflect actually the content that it covers? We did discuss this during a GSSB meeting. I don't recall the month, but one of the many meetings last year. And at the time, we decided to basically park this, to bring the indicators through into the standards, and to reopen and revisit it at a later date. The third point I want to maybe highlight is that in doing this work, the conclusion we've come to from the standards division is that it's likely that all three of the standards would require similar technical expertise in order to revise them. And that from an efficiency perspective, although we're not keen to add to the workload in the immediate term, it probably makes more sense from an efficiency standpoint to bring together a working group or a technical committee to look at all of these standards holistically, rather than running a review project on one of the standards and then trying to reconvene a similar group a year or two down the road to look at the other standards. So as I mentioned, Claudia did some initial research on behalf of the Standards Division, looking at reporting process and practice across these disclosures. And what we found, and this is a very small sample of, I think, 6 different reports, they're covered in the annex of the paper, is that for both market presence and indirect economic impacts, the reporting practice is not very comprehensive or consistent across these disclosures. And often they are reported in different ways. So a lot of the indirect economic impacts are being reported together with community impacts, as well as some of the market presence disclosures are often being grouped together under a section called community or our people or local communities. And very, very rarely do we actually see organizations talking about market presence as a material topic. I mean, many are not clear on what that is. It wouldn't come out of their materiality assessment as a material topic. And similar with indirect economic impacts. Very few organizations are categorizing that as a topic that's material for their business. They are reporting the disclosures, but they're often grouping them together underneath other topics. And given the structure we now have with the standards and the materiality and the modular approach, one of the premises of that approach is that organizations go through a materiality assessment and then they pick and choose from the topic-specific standards depending on their material topics. And if our standards don't align with commonly identified material topics, it may mean that these disclosures are not being as useful to reporters as they could be. Last here, we had an internal sort of reflection about the evolution of these disclosures, and my understanding is they've basically been brought in largely from the G3 days with very little revision or updating, and that the economic category probably received the least sort of attention or time and expertise compared to the social and the environmental disclosures, which have been more clearly defined and developed throughout GRI's evolution. And Bastian may want to chip in on this with a bit of context. And therefore, we believe there's probably some room to improve these disclosures in order to be better representative indicators of an organization's economic impacts, as opposed to what we have today, which is a little bit of a various assortment of different disclosures that have all evolved their way into these standards. Do you want to add any context to that last point, Bastian?
Maybe just that I think what we've not done as GRI over the years and during the evolution of the reporting guidance is to take stock and assess what constitutes good reporting on the economic pillar of sustainable development. And I think what we have here, and Chelsea, I think, described it very adequately, was the best guess at a certain point in time. That point in time was 2004, 2005. And arguably, we've come a long way since then. And there is reporting practice on economic impacts of business entities that has emerged, and that is probably not reflected in what we are offering. But more importantly also, I think that whole sustainable development notion and the articulation of what expectations under these 3 pillars of sustainable development actually are, that discussion has evolved quite significantly as well. One reference is certainly also the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. So in that sense, a holistic review at this point in time is probably the preferred option over piecemeal fixes of individual items here. That's I think the position that we're presenting today.
Thank you, Bastian. And that does actually take us into our next slide, which is about really turning it over to you for some discussion and ideas. So as outlined in the paper, from our perspective in the Standards Division, we are recommending that the GSSB consider expanding the scope of this review. We are aware that that has implications potentially on the scope of work and also potentially on the project timeline. It's good to note we don't have a timeline confirmed for this work right now. All we have committed to do publicly is to open the review for this standard in 2017, which does give us quite a bit of flexibility. But I think I would now turn it over to Judy to guide you sort of through these two questions. Do you agree first with expanding the scope of review? And if so, do you also agree with the proposed approach, which would be basically to pull together a project working group, or it could be a technical committee, to really first consider what kinds of content should be covered underneath this economic category. And then from that starting point, what types of disclosures would be generated to be reflective of that content. And then it would probably come back to the board to consider what that means in terms of our structure. So is that potentially two different standards? Is it keeping the existing standards and retitling some of them? Is it looking at merging them together? What actually makes the most sense both for reporters and also for the objectives of the standards?
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so we have two pieces of discussion material to get through here. The first proposal, as is framed in the background paper, we started with the question of GRI 201. It became quite clear early on that 202 and 203 were closely related to the content of 201, and it seemed sensible to look at them all together. Does the board agree with this as an approach to expand the scope of review to include GRI 201, 202, and 203 altogether as a piece? Jürgen.
Well, I think the arguments are very clear. I would certainly agree with this approach to have a look at all the three standards. And I would tend to believe we have to merge them later on. But that's another discussion. And I fully agree with the proposal also with respect to the working group.
Okay.
In the way as it was suggested here.
Kirsten.
Thank you for a very good review Thank you for a very good review from Chelsea and Bastian. While the two other standards that we have already started the process for review, they are simply just not updated, so they need updates. But when we come to these three standards, they are just confusing. And the research you have done, in my opinion, is a clear indication of the very mixed content in each standard and the very confusing name of the three standards. And that's probably also why they don't pop up in materiality analysis. Of course, all companies would say that economic performance is material, but then they look into, well, what are we looking for here? And it's something completely different than what management thought they would find there. And I think it's a very good idea to review them, the three of them together, and be very open-minded of what should be the result of it.
Thank you. Sulema.
I do agree that the economic dimension of sustainability requires a revision right now because we are moving forward, right? But I would like to highlight that the effective contribution of a global organization to local development goes through equal pay, local purchase, local hiring, even the leaders. It's a minimum in terms of socio-economic impacts. So I do agree that the content and sometimes the title of those disclosures are not clear enough, but in some, its content copes with the existing methods to identify, measure, and report back on local contribution to local development. So I would take care on supporting this revision only by not seeing the accurate information within the reports. Because there are a challenge on certain global organizations to disclose that there's no equal pay, for instance. The former EC5, it's been a challenge forever. But it's not because the companies, in my experience as consultant, are not understanding the requirement of the disclosure. It's because they just don't want to disclose that in certain regions, they're paying less to women. It's not my information, it's information from UN, right? So I really would take care of why we are revising this set of disclosures. And when revising, maybe we should provide more guidance on how to report in a more detailed way, and tell to the global organization there's a benefit on being transparent about your performance on equal pay and effective contribution to local development. So I would stress this point, and in spite of supporting the initiative.
Thank you. Dwight?
Yeah, I think that the revision of these standards is a good idea, and I think that one of the things that we should be doing here is bringing some conceptual clarity to the distinction between economic performance of an enterprise and the economic impact of the same enterprise as it relates to sustainable development. Because one is clearly in financial reporting, and the other is clearly in sustainability reporting. And I think that when we look at these things, we should say, is that distinction clear enough? And if not, then and I think we would be doing a service for everybody if in this revision we made that clarification.
Attila?
Well, using the power of the transparency in order to help governments, institutional investors, companies, and society at large to achieve a sustainable future is certainly critical, and economic impact studies are playing a very critical role there. However, the economic impact studies by nature could be conducted on several different methodologies through the use of the social accountability metrics or input-output analysis. And these technicalities truly depends of the state state statistical institutes' inputs and the quality of work that has been put in evidence by the very respective national authorities. So it might not necessarily present the same kind of quality or at least a calibration. So for a multiple country operation, for large multinationals, or for regional companies, that might truly pose a benchmarking problem, just to take into consideration.
Thank you. Other thoughts on this? Kent?
Yeah, I was very interested in Dwight's comments because there's some interaction here with financial reporting, and right now there's kind of a hodgepodge overlap. And to what extent do we want that overlap, or do we want to separate it? I mean, to what extent do we want to get involved in financial reporting? I think it's just a good question, but I like the way that you describe it.
Stian?
I certainly support the notion. What Dwight said is clear separation of what you report where. We are doing an exercise right now in terms of mapping out where gaps are in terms of what investors, stakeholders, analysts require from us. And I'll share over lunchtime with the GRI Secretariat, where we are in that research, and maybe that can help the way forward as well.
Dwight? No? Okay. Okay, I think, I believe, Chelsea, that you have consensus from the board as to the first question. Yes, we support the consideration altogether of these three standards. Can we look specifically at the second question, which has to do with the mechanics of this and the formation of a working group to first consider what content should be covered under these topics and develop draft disclosures, and then come back to GSSB for input, determining whether we need to have additional working groups or technical committees. Now, Chelsea, I believe in your presentation of this, you did propose that it, in the first instance, could either be a project working group or a technical committee that makes this first set of judgments. And it seems to me that we ought to have some discussion about what that means and what the what's at stake in that decision, and how we might go about making a choice as to where would a technical committee arise from. So perhaps could you give us a little bit more framing around that second question for discussion?
Sure. So basically, under the due process protocol, the GSSB has two different options. Typically, in order to develop a standard, the normal sort of path forward would be to put together the multi-constituency project working group, like we've done for OHS and water. But you also have the ability to opt out of that and to form instead an ad hoc technical committee, either to supplement the work of a working group or, in fact, to develop initial technical content. And the advantage of that is that we wouldn't need to sort of tick all of the boxes in terms of multi-constituencies, so it could be a more focused, more efficient process. I think here, in terms of immediate next steps, moving on from the discussion on point one, we would go away, the standards division, and put together a project proposal would be the next step to move this forward under the due process. And that's a short sort of 2-page document outlining the scope and the objectives of the review. And that could come together before we made a decision on whether or not a technical committee or a project working group was required. But really what would be useful from this group is to have a voice on what kinds of organizations, stakeholder views are really critical to have represented in the development of understanding what content fits under that category and what specific disclosures might be developed. So would you foresee that being the work of a couple of expert organizations being brought together to have at least a first draft at that? Or would you see actually there being a need to really make sure that all viewpoints are represented together in developing that work from the start? And I think the other thing to add is that these aren't mutually exclusive, so it's possible you could have a technical committee do the first drafting work, and then we might decide that actually a full working group was needed to carry this forward. There are options like that, but we're not experts in this content space. We haven't done significant research yet, so we don't yet know exactly which organizations or institutions are also going to be most relevant for taking this forward either yet.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Anyone wish to open the discussion on this as to thoughts whether a project working group straight off the bat is merited here, whether there's a technical committee that could do some initial scoping, whether we need more information possibly that the standards division needs to put together for us? Julia, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a good idea to start with the technical committee first, because I like the way that Dwight put it in terms of performance and impact. And there could be, if you do more research about what indicators are already out there, and you know what's lacking, what's the gap, that could really help advise a working group or whatever form it would take going forward.
Sulema?
Well, from my side, I need more information from the standards division in order to advise where we should establish a technical committee right now. This is a very complex issue. The economic impacts, some global organizations are studying and trying to figure out how to measure it for 20 years at least. So I really need more information in order to give my opinion on that.
Kirsten?
Sorry about that. It starts becoming a habit forgetting the mic. I agree with Sulema that this is a very complicated area. And due to that, I do think it could be a good idea to start with a technical committee to do the necessary research and then develop it to a work group later on. At the same time, we need to make sure that what we do develop is something that can be useful for the reporting organizations as well as for the users of the report. But without making it useful and applicable for the reporting organizations, we will not succeed in what we are doing, whatever perfect it is from the reporting users. Because we can't get out all kind of information, even though it looks easy from the outside. Some of the information we're already requesting in the GRI standards is very difficult to collect in a good way and to make trustworthy information from. So we have to be really careful here.
Stian.
Going to play devil's advocate again. Look at what is on the charter there. Enable credible, consistent and high quality sustainability reporting. If we don't know what we want, we're not going to achieve that. So scoping of it is crucial. My support is to start off with a small group, technical committee, and then go forward. You know, scope it clearly, understand what we want and where we want to go with this.
So you're testing my knowledge of our due process protocol, but there is another provision in the protocol that allows us that gives you a few options in addition to just forming a working group or a technical committee, which is to determine whether or not to hold either a public forum or a roundtable or issue a consultation paper to seek views on a topic under development is one option that this group would have. And that could be developing a project proposal and putting it out for exposure and comments initially, perhaps with the sake of trying to find organizations, academics, institutions that are doing relevant work in this area. That may be one option. The second option to consider would be, to Kirsten's point about feasibility and sort of accessibility of disclosures for reporters. We also have the option, or you have the option, to carry out a field test of draft standards either before or after public comment. So it is possible, we did not do this last year for the projects under development, but it's possible that a technical committee could put together draft disclosures or a draft standard, and that those could then be field tested. What that includes is not explicit in the due process protocol, but with groups of reporters to ensure that they actually would be feasible and workable from a reporter perspective. So there are a few other permutations that are possible, depending really on what we see as being the objectives of the project moving forward.
Can I suggest, in light of the discussion that we've been having, it does seem to me that the board is supportive of a process that would elucidate further information at this point and give us a bit more on which to make a decision about precisely how to go forward. We're probably not there yet in terms of a project working group. Whether we want to commission a technical committee or whether we want to do a number of these other possible steps, as you've just described, Chelsea, I think is not entirely clear to the board. And perhaps could the standards division make a proposal for us, maybe at our next meeting, to let us know what would be some reasonable steps to take to help us generate that information to move us forward on a particular path. Yeah.
I think absolutely. And the only other request I would have is if you are aware of organizations, experts, groups that are working on relevant elements of this, to come in and flag them to us. So you will exponentially increase the efficiency of our development of that proposal if you can also give us the benefit of whatever might be in your head or in your networks.
Right.
But absolutely, that sounds good.
Okay. All right. Good. Oh, I'm sorry. Michel, yes.
Yes, just a fast comment. If you want indicators for that, in the descriptions of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, you have sets of indicators for each of them. It's a total of about 250 indicators. Mm-hmm. And so probably relevant impact indicators should be looked somewhere among those.
Good. Okay, I think we're satisfied on this particular point.
Okay, thank you, Judy. So the next discussion topic was to move us on to the issue of tax. So the question for the GSSB here is really to have a reflection point before we move ahead with this work. So In the work program, it's outlined that we consider the development of additional content related to tax and payments to governments. This is our consideration point at the first instance. And the question is, should we proceed down this path with looking to develop new disclosures related to tax transparency, tax reporting, and if so, what form could this take? So why are we talking about tax? First, tax transparency is an increasingly important issue within the Sustainable Development Agenda. It has really close links to poverty alleviation and wealth inequality. So Michelle mentioned the SDGs. You all are aware, and we'll hear more this afternoon about multiple other projects GRI is involved in related to reporting on the SDGs and how to bring our standards into better alignment with the SDGs. Well, how do companies contribute towards wealth inequality and poverty alleviation? A lot of reporters in our network are really struggling on this. They want to report against the SDGs. It turns out actually it's really hard to figure out how your business relates to these kinds of concepts and what impact you have. But one of the ways in which businesses do contribute to these issues is through their payment of tax. And that's receiving a lot of attention from civil society organizations, but also increasingly from government, intergovernmental organizations, and also investment institutions. So a little bit more background. There's a little bit of information in the paper here, and we also have a source of reference or resource documents that Claudia and I have been reading through, which we can refer you to if you want additional detail. But essentially, current financial reporting requirements are considered not sufficient by experts that we've spoken to, on experts in this area, to really drive the greater transparency on tax reporting at a country-by-country level that's required in order to increase stakeholder transparency about these issues. So the base erosion and profit shifting package passed under the OECD, which has 15 actions. Action 13 of that package already requires country-level reporting on tax payments, but only to tax authorities, not in the public domain. Currently, only the extractives and the financial sectors have country-level public tax reporting requirements. So that's covered under the EITI and the Dodd-Frank Act for extractives, and the Country Directives Initiative 4 for financial institutions. Both of these require less detail than under the BEPS package of the OECD. There is currently a proposed amendment to the EU accounting directive, not a tax directive, but an accounting directive, which is on the table with the EU Commission, which would be a game changer. It requires information similar in terms of calculation to what's already required under the OECD BEPS package, but that would be public reporting at a country-by-country level. It would be for large organizations with turnover over 750 million, I think, euros. And it would affect potentially, according to our contact at the OECD, roughly 10,000 companies would be required to do public reporting underneath this proposed amendment. However, we don't have any clear indication that approval is likely, that would move past the proposal stage. So who's leading the call for greater tax transparency? Actually, a lot of organizations. And the more research you do, the more you find both not only civil society, so you see on the left, we spoke with the FACT Coalition. Oxfam has really wrapped this up into the sort of poverty alleviation agenda with a lot of calls for better transparency and anti-tax corruption. The Tax Justice Network is very active in this space as well. The B Team, which is Richard Branson's organization, does a lot of work on anti-corruption and also on tax reporting and transparency. But also you'll see on the right-hand side, a lot of investor groups are getting behind this agenda in a major way. So they're publishing research around the real risk for investors related to tax avoidance or unclear tax strategies, arguing that these issues are really financially material for investors, and management has access to this information, but investors don't have access to this information for decision making. And we were pointed to an op-ed piece which was published in the New York Times, I think it's 2016, by BlackRock, really coming out from an investor perspective about how they see this as a major issue. UNPRI as well has come out with guidance around corporate tax responsibility, and also a number, of course, of major accounting firms and others have taken positions around supporting clients in getting ahead of the curve with tax reporting and greater transparency. So just a summary of sort of what we found. We've spoken to 3 organizations and done a fair amount of desktop research. We have had great engagement and support from the experts we've spoken to, and we have a wealth of contacts ready to speak with us, but we wanted to have the initial discussion with the GSSB before we move down this route and spend any more time sort of doing the scoping work. So what we've heard is that previously, prior to the OECD BEPS package coming into implementation, the concern from businesses was compliance cost. We can't possibly report on a country-by-country level about our tax payments because it's just far too expensive. We cannot pull together that data. But then the OECD BEPS package happened and it hit, and actually companies have been able to report so far. So the first sort of transactions are coming into play this year, but companies have already had to pull that information together. And now the concern from the business sector has shifted from compliance costs to corporate confidentiality. So if we put our tax strategy and our tax payments into the public domain, it represents confidential business strategy information which would put us at a competitive disadvantage. And interestingly, what we've heard, particularly from civil society organizations, is that there's very little incentive for companies to be first movers in this area. So they may be supportive in general of greater tax transparency, but they perceive there to be a real risk for them in being one of the only few companies to put this information into the public domain, and that it could be used against them, could present a risk both from the investor perspective, but also from civil society organizations. It could make them vulnerable. And therefore, what we've seen and what we've heard is that companies who are coming out in support of this are doing so more through lobbying and engagement with governments to help show their support for potentially more mandatory public reporting requirements, as opposed to saying, look, we're going to be a first mover in this space on our own on a voluntary basis. I did attend a conference in London a few weeks ago on sustainability reporting, and Vodafone actually gave a really fascinating, I was probably the most interested one in the audience, presentation about tax reporting. My ears really perked up, but they actually are one of the very, very few companies to go out with public detailed level information on tax, and they did this in response to having a real media crisis about tax fraud, which put them very much on the front pages of newspapers in the UK, and their response has been to become overly transparent and to try and really over-communicate their issues out to the audience. But again, they're coming out of a reactive position there as opposed to a proactive role. And the last point is really that what we've heard is that interest from investors is accelerating. And that is not, sorry, investor constituencies, it's not being driven by an altruistic desire around the poverty alleviation agenda. This is really tied to a financial risk perspective, but really supporting a similar type of outcome. So what we've collected is basically a general sense that input from the experts engaged in this space believe that current financial reporting requirements don't go far enough. They do see GRI having a potentially unique role to play in driving voluntary or promoting greater uptake of voluntary reporting, or at least greater transparency in how organizations are communicating about their tax strategy or their tax payments. However, they do caution that uptake of those voluntary reporting measures could be a real challenge. So I think that covers most of the background context. A final few words on implications for us, and Bastian and I have discussed this a number of times, and this is really open for your debate and input as well. What would this mean for us? This is quite a departure from GRI's work on developing standards in the past, where we really look to codify into the standards current reporting practice or issues that companies are already reporting on. It's a really high-profile issue, and there is a fair amount of controversy, particularly from the business sector. So I imagine we would have varied support. There could also certainly be a perception that GRI is stepping into the financial reporting space too much, and that that's not really our bread and butter, and we would need to really communicate clearly what we saw the purpose being and why GRI has a role to play. On the high-profile nature of the issue, there is a potential that we could raise awareness on the issue, but also raise a lot of awareness about GRI and the role of the standards in general, and that would be in a way that we won't get from developing content or reviewing existing content in the standards, and that this takes us into a bit of a new and pioneering space for sustainability reporting. So how could this work within our structure? We don't have to make decisions on this today, but just to give you a view into the options for what that could look like if we decide to proceed down this path. And these are not mutually exclusive options, but you could include high-level disclosures around tax strategy or tax structure within the general disclosures, probably within the universal standards. You could also incorporate disclosures within what we just discussed, the economic standards, so whatever GRI 201 economic performance becomes in its next iteration. Or you also could develop a new topic-specific standard on tax and payments to governments or something similar, which would probably then nestle within the economic series. And there are trade-offs between all of these options, which we discuss a bit more in item 05. So with that, the questions for you really are just to get a discussion and a read from the group about your appetite to take on this work. Do you see it being something which is in the scope of work for the GSSB to do? And if so, do you agree with the proposed approach that we've outlined? And do you have any additional comments or considerations that we would take into account if we do move ahead with developing a project proposal? So with that, Judy, I'll hand it over back to you.
Thank you, Chelsea. Just for the record, I think I'm like you, actually. I find this a far more interesting topic than you might imagine. So we've got a number of people who've raised their placards. I'll have Julia, Jürgen, and then Kirsten and Evan. We've only just opened the discussion, and all four were raised. So if you'd like to go first, please do, Kirsten.
I'm sorry about that. It became a thing for me, having been overseen so many times. First of all, I definitely support putting tax on the GRI agenda. I think that is very important. And it is important for many reasons, not least for the difference between the need of putting it on the agenda from an extra financial perspective contra the financial perspective. While the financial success factor is to pay as little tax as possible, the extra financial is to pay as much tax as possible. In a way, not, please don't misunderstand me too far. But tax is at the same time a very challenging issue because there are so big differences in tax regulation from country to country. So even though we put up something, it might not be comparable. And another thing is that from the financial perspective, it's usually the tax incurred that is reported on, while from the extra financial perspective, it's more tax paid. And that are two very different things. And it is not correct, as stated in the paper here, that this information is collected anyway, because that's incurred tax mostly, I believe, while we need tax paid also. So the EITI reporting is on tax paid, and we have to use completely different mechanisms to collect that information from collecting the incurred tax that is collected through the financial accounts, etc. Having said that, we have been reporting on incurred tax by country for many years. We have also recorded according to the EITI, but that is only on the countries where we have extractive industries. So it's complicated, and there are many things to take into account, but that doesn't mean that this isn't important. Thank you.
Okay. Julia.
Yep, I want to say first kudos to the GRI team for that research. It's very complete, and I think it's very true that in the past year, certainly I've noticed an uptick in the number of different pieces out there from a lot of different viewpoints around tax. I would agree that it's important and something that should be included in the standards. I would say maybe that the second option that you shared, Chelsea, in terms of incorporating it into an existing topic-specific standard makes the most sense. And in terms of the comment about uptake being a challenge, I would certainly agree with that. That just generally speaking, companies will be hesitant to be first movers on that. But I think that GRI's role here is really valid in putting it out there as something that's important. And even if it takes a number of years for companies to adopt it, there's still value in GRI coming out with something publicly on it.
Okay, I've got Jürgen, and then Evan, and then Daniel, and Stian.
Well, I am also of the opinion that GRI has to pick up the tax issue. We can't do it, or we can't leave it behind, because it is visible and obvious. There is a global train on track running into that direction. Public pressure is increasing. The GRI should not be running after that train. We have to pick it up now. Chelsea presented a number of very clear reasons. We cannot deal with sustainable development goals without speaking about taxes. Last but not least, the GRI as a whole and we as individuals committed ourselves to act in the public interest. So, how can we mean that seriously whilst staying quiet about this tax issue? We have to pick it up. In which way? I'm not 100% sure. I tend a little bit to put it into the Standard 102 to make it a general approach for everybody that nobody can avoid. It was clearly said the competition issue, right? Some do it, others don't. Therefore, it's in the interest of the reporters also that they cannot, that no reporter can avoid speaking about the tax issue. That's my tendency, but I admit we still need a bit more discussion to have a clearer picture. I may change my mind. It's a tendency I have at the moment to put it into Standard 102, but I'm interested also to listen to other arguments of more experienced reporters about this detail. But in my view, there shouldn't be any question about whether we should pick that subject up or not. To me, it's very clear we have to.
Well, I'll assume the role of stating the obvious. This is a minefield of an issue. As much as I believe in it, and I believe that it's strongly correlated with sustainability performance, we used it one of the 33 indicators that the stock exchanges agreed was universally applicable for all companies, far and away the most controversial one to include, far and away the least amount of consensus on that issue around the world and in different companies and with different investors. I've heard every one of those corporate pushbacks that was on Chelsea's slide 41 from companies about why we can't do this or why this is impractical. As a board member for the U.S. Network for the UN Global Compact, I'm a strong supporter of our alignment with OECD and trying to get tax transparency into whatever we do with the Global Compact. We think it's an important driver. But in terms of the impact on practical uptake of sustainability reporting, to me, this puts GRI squarely in the advocacy realm rather than the codifier realm. And that may be a role that we inherit willingly, but it's something that we should consider because it's going to provoke a lot of pushback in terms of the presumed overreach of sustainability reporting in general, which is a brush that paints our effort in a lot of ways.
Yeah, just to agree with a lot of those comments, particularly Evan's helpful comments just there. Just thinking this through, I mean, one document that you referred to there, Chelsea, helpfully, was the PRI document, which I actually did input into when it first came out. It's actually very focused on corporate tax. And I just sort of wondered, before getting into the minefield, whether we could try and go away and be a bit clearer as to sort of which elements of tax that we're talking about, whether this is tax specifically pertaining to contribution to sustainable developments, that might be things like carbon tax, or whether it's looking at companies' sort of contribution to corporate tax, in sort of breaking that down into different aspects of health and education. And within that, sort of trying to define specifically which area of tax we're talking about, I wonder whether it might be worth looking at existing disclosures in the same way that we just did with the economic piece, try and pick out sort of half a dozen companies particularly their sustainability reporting, and see what linkages we could find there. And one that springs to mind when I was looking at this some time ago was BG Group in the UK did a very nice sort of breakdown of how different taxes that they pay are then hypothecated to different public services, which I thought was very nice. You can see that sort of dollar flowing through the economic system, which I think is perhaps quite a sort of helpful place to start. I think the other thing is just, I think the thing that investors are sort of striving for in some ways is sort of trying to get a bit of simplicity out of this. So I think one of the challenges, if we've got different methods and modes of reporting of tax policies and structures, are we, is there a simpler way for companies to report on this? And the challenge for companies is then sort of, just to try and step back a little bit into, trying to focus on the high level questions like policy and structure before getting into some of the trickier country by country disclosures. That just some of my thoughts.
Okay, I have quite a queue at the moment of people, and I'm going to try to do it in the order that I think I saw them go up in, but please bear with me here. I believe I have Stian and then possibly Robin, and then a whole bunch opened up over here. So I'll do Sulema, and then Michelle, and then Kirsten and Chelsea. Yeah? Stian.
As everybody have said, this is a minefield, and we as reporters face it, so we have to address it. One of the options as a curveball, I think, Chelsea, what you've just read in the previous session, is in the due process, is convening a sort of workshop or a public discussion or a focus group on this topic. It's a financial reporting matter. If we go that way and suggest what needs to be done, we are venturing into financial reporting grounds, and we need to be very careful. The challenge that I put out for us is, can we influence, can we play that advocacy role that Evan referred to, rather than taking it on as a GRI task, but play an advocacy role to bring about change in the financial reporting.
Thank you. I think the discussion places a lot of pressure, I suppose, on the first phase of the working group or the technical committee that is going to look at the 200 series generally. So that notion of having a group that's going to clarify and articulate where the standards fit in relation to broader economic development in the sustainable development context, and tax should form part of that discussion. And I think the second issue around where tax sits in relation to the standards generally, whether or not there's the overall tax strategy should be something that's universal, and the indicators sit in the 200 series. I think some of that depends on the first question around what the role is in terms of broader sustainable development. So if we were going to imagine how else would a company consider and raise tax to be a material issue, what does that materiality process look like through an impact lens? So I think we have to clarify, imagine how that process would work internally for it to be picked up as a material issue from an impact on sustainability perspective.
Thank you, Judy. I'm thinking, surprisingly, I do agree with our colleagues from the financial market. I really think that the value of the taxation would be very challenging to engage with the companies to be transparent about the amount of money that they are paying by country, by region. On the other hand, there are some frameworks and initiatives that are seeking for more high-level information about policy, management structure, how the companies are avoiding I just wrote down the precise term, to address or seek or accepting exemptions in terms of tax payment. So before assembling a technical committee or a working group on this matter, I would seek for more information for those that are using information about taxation. For instance, Dow Jones Sustainability Index does require for the companies to disclose about their taxation policy and how they seek to avoid the compensation or exemptions to the payment of taxes. Because let's face it, the amount of money, I'm from Brazil. Everybody knows about corruption and how the government is being supported by money not declared, not formally declared money. So the amount of money that a company is paying for the government in Brazil means nothing in terms of contribution for poverty alleviation or contribution for education. So I would seek for more precise information on how the other organizations or other initiatives are using taxation information in order to scope, to draft the first scope. Thank you.
Michel.
First, I share fully the analysis that has been presented, that it's a rising topic and that we should expect it to be included in legislation sooner or later. So I would be in favor of GRI working on it, if only to be prepared on the dates into legislation to say that GRI is a way to answer it. Further than that, I think the more we talk about it, the more we will find out that the boundaries between financial reporting and sustainability reporting becomes blurred. But as far as I know today, outside of impact for investors, there are no impact indicators at all on any other group of stakeholders in financial reporting today. So I still think that it's a topic for the GRI.
Kirsten.
Yeah, I agree that it is it is a topic for the GRI. I also believe that it is important to cooperate with the financial world here, because we can't invent our own things here. That is double work, and it won't be practical for the reporting organizations. And I think it's a good idea that what Jürgen came up with, that it should be under 102, but I don't think we should make a decision on that yet, but we should bring that with us as an option.
Chelsea and then Bastian.
Yeah, just to respond, I think, to Daniel's point about what form could this take, I think the short answer is we don't know yet. So there are a variety of different forms, ranging from Jürgen's point about, a general disclosure about sort of how transparent are you about your tax structure and payments. So giving companies that have put more of that out into the public domain the ability to say so and to point to where that information is. I think it's very much the case that we're not looking to come up with compilation methodologies for reporting tax, that this is infinitely complicated and not probably in the realm of where GRI ever would want to play. But there are sort of emerging under the OECD requirements or others, emerging methodologies for how companies need to be putting that information together in a standardized way already to provide to tax authorities. And certainly some of that's already been developed and adopted by companies we would need to align with as much as possible if we ever went down the path of developing or referencing disclosures related to that. So I think there could be sort of hierarchies of information, basically from the, giving you a platform to demonstrate how transparent you are already, all the way down to, if you are transparent at a country-by-country level, where is that information published hierarchy.
Maybe just to add to the whole discussion, I think that we're having the discussion in the first place is probably a testament to the fact that GRI and GSB, the GRI standards, have become a reference point. There is actually out there the expectation that GRI delivers more on issues that seem aspirational now, but will become commonplace and expectation very soon. And I think there's more recognition for GI and the fact that there is a tool with the standards and there's a global common language emerging. And the expectation that GI is proactive in accommodating these issues. How that works exactly is probably the discussion that we're having. It is on a case-by-case basis. But at the outset of when GI started, everything was aspirational, basically. We've moved into something that Chelsea adequately described as we were following best practice and tried to codify. But with the speed by which the sustainable development discussion is developing, but also some of these issues become highly relevant just for societies to thrive and become more public. I think as we're now moving back to a phase in the evolution where we have to be responsive to these things. And even if, I think several members of the GSB have mentioned that as to stay up to date and stay in tune with the public discourse on sustainable development. So it's an interesting change, I think, over time that we're observing. What I would like to flag is it's one of at least 5, maybe 10 issues that are currently pending out there that have an equal, that could be described as a minefield, as an opportunity, certainly as aspirational, but we will have many more for you resulting out of the SDG discussion, but also other societal debates and things that are currently not well covered in corporate transparency.
Okay. Obviously, this is a very controversial sort of topic, but it's controversial for a number of reasons, such as what is the objective? I mean, I think there's no consensus among observers and people participating in the debate as to what the right, sort of result is as a consequence of reporting transparently on tax strategy, tax payments, or the impact of tax payments within given countries or regions, whose behavior or decisions are we seeking to influence by introducing this to the sustainability reporting, organizational sustainability reporting agenda? How much is the right amount of tax for organizations to pay in any given circumstance, and who gets to decide? These are absolutely at the heart of why this is a controversial subject, and there are things that we are just simply not going to be able to resolve about that kind of wide-ranging debate. So I think part of the challenge here for us is to figure out what things can we resolve, what things will it be legitimate for GRI to attempt to resolve, and what would be the contribution that would be made by that. So you have a lot of support around the table, I believe, for exploring this topic further. Can we ask the Standards Division to come back with a bit more of a worked up proposal around what the options might be and how we can take a conversation forward?
Yes, I think there are two sort of immediate options that come to mind. It would be good to get a read from this group on which one makes the most sense for us sort of coming away from this meeting. The first would be to mock up a project proposal with potentially a proposed sort of representation or starting point for who might form a technical committee that could then do some work to come back to the table with some ideas for us about what those options might look like and how we could build on existing frameworks, disclosures that are already out there. That might be one approach, in which case what you would see at the next, I don't want to say necessarily the next meeting, but potentially the second GSSB meeting would be a project proposal with a clearer scope, additional research, some thoughts around what a technical committee might comprise or the viewpoints that might need to be represented there. The second option we would have would be to put out a consultation paper at this early stage to solicit additional stakeholder views and to get a read on what sort of appetite there is for different versions of disclosures relating to tax transparency. Now, that has some advantage in that we could get early buy-in. We could actually get a lot of that sort of research brought in through responses to the consultation or ideas about how to move that forward, but it also has the risk that if there is a lot of pushback, for example, from the business sector, that gets shut down right away, even before it moves into options for how that gets incorporated into the standards. So that's what comes to mind for me, having listened to this discussion as immediate options. it would be good to maybe just get a sense of whether there's a steer one versus the other, so we can come back to you with the most appropriate next set of steps.
Okay, Robin?
Sorry, could I just clarify? So this would be a technical committee that's looking at the whole 200 series, or this would be a separate one just for tax?
I think based on our research, it would have to be separate for tax. The people working on actually the tax issues probably have less overlap with what we discussed previously, which is why we separated them out.
So just as a follow-up, I think it would be worth, I mean, in terms of the timing, to have that dedicated front-end piece, whether it's a technical committee or some other mechanism that's looking at the rationale and positioning of the 200 series in the first instance, that frames why tax would be part of that package. So what GRI means by what looks like more of a blank canvas with the economic development piece. It's not a review, it's a reinvention. So to have that frame of looking at the scope and the intention and the rationale for GRI's role in the overall economic development piece, and that tax is framed within that. Does that make sense? Yeah? Sorry.
Sulema?
It's just a quick question. Actually, I'm putting an elephant at this table because I'm thinking about other organizations than business reporting on this issue. So let's think about governments. There are some governments that are required or obliged by law to be transparent about where they're putting the money raised from taxation, but in other places they're not. So I would think also when mocking up or when performing public consultation to include this stakeholder as the user of this disclosure, the government.
Other thoughts?
Maybe just one reflection on Robin's comment. I think for what we have now in terms of research conversations on the tax issue, I think the standards division feels comfortable that there is a rationale and a good evidence that work should be happening on GRI's part, GSSB part, in that space. And we don't necessarily have to wait for building out the case for this is economic impact and therefore sustainability reporting, this is economic performance and therefore financial reporting. So we can actually anticipate already that tax is likely going to be, at least in part, firmly in the core of what the GSB will be working on going forward by advancing the sustainability reporting agenda. There are details to be sorted for sure. I think it is that piece of overlap between the nexus of financial reporting and non-financial reporting that Michelle was also referring to. That's an interesting one to be explored by that other subcommittee. But just in the interest of time and also building a network in that discussion, it is probably good to advance the research agenda, look at institutions that we could work with to scope out that space, and then have at the next meeting actually the opportunity for you to give green light to move it into an official standard setting process of some kind. And if we arrive at that point and say, well, in actual fact, the rationale doesn't hold together, we don't have the right buy-in, we don't have the institutional support around it, then we can still stop at that point, work more on the first piece of economic impact, and then revisit that at a later stage. But just in terms of how we could also use these new topics to well, advertise our work externally, show proactive behavior on behalf of a standard setter in this domain, I feel we should be continuing to at least the research element and the project proposal development in the coming months.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think given you've said there are sort of half a dozen, 10 other topics that are similar to this, we're obviously sort of setting a precedence of how we should go about approaching those through this tax piece. But I also agree that this scoping piece, there's one line in here that says the link between tax and the sustainable development agenda is undeniable. I would like to see more, just to be able to sort of justify that particular statement before going into technical committees and into consultation. So I would agree with Robin on that.
It is, of course, quite possible for us to start a consultation, review where we get to, and keep the consultation open for a period of time while things develop. We don't necessarily have to bring it to conclusion in the next couple of months. So I think, do you feel you've got what you need from the board at this point to start something?
To start something, yeah, let me paraphrase so I'm clear on what I think we're hearing from this group. It sounds like the immediate next steps would be for us to go back and put together a proposal on what that project could look like. That's an official process we have to follow with the board. And that doesn't have to include the outcome of that work. It doesn't have to say this will be its own standard. It doesn't have to say this will require country-by-country reporting. This just is basically the objectives of the project moving us forward. And then within that, we can bring back to you our thoughts as they develop as well about whether or not we think we already have ideas about a technical committee that could do that initial scoping and drafting work to at least bring together some more concrete options for the board to consider before we decide whether or not that becomes a standard, a disclosure, or nothing. Or whether or not we think actually it makes sense at that point, once the GSSB reviews a proposal, to then move into a pre-consultation actually to solicit additional views on that. So I think that looks like maybe us doing a little bit more write-up and research to bring back to this group, with also some ideas by then about how to advance that immediately.
Kent.
I'd just like to make one comment on that. I think also more justification for it. That is, this is a controversial area, and we want to be able to support, if we want to go forward in this area, we need to provide those justifications. So again, tie into the SDGs, for instance, a little bit more information about that I think would be very helpful.
Okay. Thank you all for that discussion, and thank you to the Standards Division for all of that work in prepping the conversation this morning. This has been the final session of the public meeting today. We have a number of administrative matters and information issues to go through later on today, but we reconvene the public meeting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock Amsterdam time. So all that remains for me is to say thank you to all of the members present today and all those who have contributed to the conversation, and to close the meeting for today, reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.